I'm Matt Schaefer. I'm from the Hoover Library. I'm going to throw a question out. You're all bright, aspiring history students of some sort. Tell me one thing about Herbert Hoover. Fire away.
He was born in Iowa.
Two things. Second thing. When was he president? Actually, no. During the Great Depression. This is what Hoover is known for in America. This is my frame. This is how I begin all of my discussions about Hoover. If you know one thing about him, president during the Great Depression. Ask your grandparents. You know, they probably didn't vote for him the second time. Nobody would. But in World War I, Herbert Hoover hadn't become the greatest, or hadn't joined that list of the 10 worst presidents in American history. He was an Iowa guy by birth, but not by any sort of definition. He defined himself as a Californian as World War I broke out. And where do we begin? We begin with him born here in West Branch, orphaned at age 9, gets on a train, goes to Oregon, lives with his uncle for the next 6 years, goes to Stanford to become study geology, become a mining engineer. He chose Stanford because it was tuition free. He goes out into the world, makes a fortune as a mining engineer. He is, by the time he's 35 years old, probably the richest self-made man in America. One of his mates from Stanford wrote and said, Burt, old boy, it's rumored that you're worth $10 million. How can a man your age be worth so much? And he writes back, George, no one our age could have earned $10 million, honestly. I'm worth but 5. Which is one of my favorite Hoover letters in all the collection. It's a humble brag. I wish you all have the luck to make that statement. I have a map of the world here in a very gross way, showing, backwards. Okay. Hoover is based in London as a mining engineer, but he has enterprises in Russia, in China, in Burma, in Australia, in South Africa, in the Western Hemisphere. He has traveled around the world 7 times by the time he's 35 years old. And he's made $5 million, and he's tired of the game of making money. This is back in a day when you could do that. You could be tired of making money. And he sends a letter to his friend and says, I'm interested in getting into public service. Can you sort of float my name around in the States? And this friend of his says, well, there's this thing called the Bureau of Mines, just created by Taft's government. I'll send him a letter letting him know that you're interested. Well, Taft, the president, chose one of his friends from the coal industry, and Hoover said, rats. But don't let them forget me. So again, Hoover's name is floated in DC in 1913 when President Wilson says, I need someone to oversee, basically review the production and building of the Panama Canal. And again, Hoover has his name floated. Wilson says, I've got somebody else to do that. So here's our guy, Burt, as a 37-year-old, looking dapper, ready to get into the bigger game of public service. Public service ultimately finds Hoover. In World War I, when World War I breaks out, he's in London with his wife and 2 kids. When war breaks out, stuff happens. 1, banks close. Travel is interdicted. When World War I broke out in August 1914, there were roughly 100 to 120,000 Americans in Europe doing the continental tour. This is old custom for people of some means. When war breaks out, we see a German blockade in the North Sea and in the North Atlantic. We see a British blockade a little bit farther out, again, setting up the outer limits of war. With 100,000 people in London saying, or 100,000 people in Europe, many of them getting back to London saying, I gotta get home. I don't want to spend any more time in a war zone than I have to. And Hoover is tapped by the American ambassador, sets up the American Residence Committee, and begins the process of getting people resources and tickets to go back home to America. This is how Hoover spends the first 6 weeks of the war. His wife is right there. She sets up the Resident American Women's Committee to help destitute American women, teachers primarily, and students in college to get back stateside. Hoover does this basically on his own initiative, with his own money, with the idea these people will pay him back. He loans about $120,000 in August and September of 1914 and gets paid back all but $130 of that over the course of the next several months. Funny stories, there was one woman there who was pissed that she was going to be sent back in steerage. Okay, boats, we saw the Lusitania, first class, you're above, you can get out on deck. Second class, you're a bit closer to the waterline. Third class, or steerage, you're basically never going to see the light of day for the 6 days you're on the ship. And this woman was a woman of means, said, I will not go back in steerage, and went on a hunger strike. Hoover had her, said, that's fine, do what you follow your conscience, had her sit outside the restaurant at the Hotel Savoy in London. Her hunger strike lasted about 7 hours. Subtle. Okay, on with the show. The first thing, Hoover's first action for the first 8 weeks of the war, get Americans back stateside. His second action, again, at the behest of the American ambassador in London, who says, my God, we've got a catastrophe brewing in Belgium. Belgium, a tiny country. I was going to point to it on a map when Amy had it up, but it was invisible to my eye from row number 1. It's a tiny sliver of land between Germany and France. Awkward when World War I breaks out, because the shortest line for Germany to invade France would have been through northern France, but the French, having been invaded in 1870, defended that line, the Maginot Line. So Germany said, something gets in my way, I go around it, rolled through Belgium, and Belgium, not a world power in any stretch of the imagination in 1914, that while they had colonies in Africa, their army was minuscule and ill-equipped to deal with Germany. They were hammered. And so Belgium, by the fall of 1914, by late October, is facing starvation. Because what happens in a war? You set fire to the fields, so there's no resistance behind you. You set up checkpoints, you set up choke points, papers please, papers please. Belgium ends up ends up basically crushed. The American ambassador says they don't have food to last them through Christmas. Hoover, when tapped, says the 3 kindest words in the English language. 3 kindest words in the English language might be, I love you, no, can I help? And spends what he thinks is going to be the next several months. He goes into the CRB thinking he's going to organize this agency to get through the next 4 or 5 months, get Belgium fed, and then get on with his life. Because the last European war lasted a matter of weeks. What he didn't realize was that he was entering the slippery slope to public service that was going to take him for the next 3.5 years, organizing the Commission for Relief in Belgium, which was set up as a private relief agency run by a private citizen voluntarily, marshaling people from neutral nations. We go back to what Amy was talking about, that alliance system. War means world war. War means war on all fronts. If you're neutral, you have some latitude in what you can do in a war zone. But what Hoover does is basically walks into the line of fire and says, these are innocent civilians, 3 million kids, 3 million women, they're not combatants. Let me organize a food relief effort to get them fed. And he does so with the CRB, which is, at that time, the largest food relief effort in history. Hoover in his life is going to organize the largest food relief effort in history 3 different times. If he did nothing else, that would be a pretty commendable effort. Now, you'll see the ship here, Belgian Relief, not flying any flags, no national flags. The CRB was its own flag. It was a neutral state, a piratical state for benevolence, is how it was called by George Nash. So when the ship would be stopped on the seas, they could argue, look, no arms, no war material, nothing to do with the war, it's food for Belgium. Let the ship pass. When we were talking about a blockade where that's how you stop material from getting into war zones, that was a useful tool. And it worked for the most part. Only 7 CRB ships were sunk before January 1917. January 1917 is kind of a pivot point for American and world events in World War I. It's when unrestricted submarine warfare was resumed. Millions need bread, and this, I think, is one of the earliest propaganda photos. This was the cover of a book by Edward R. Hunt called War Bread. This little Belgian girl having her sustenance for the day, a slice of hard rye bread. The bread line here, I like this because the next time bread lines show up in Hoover's life, they're in America in 1930. Inside Hoover humor. Okay, challenges to meet. He's got to negotiate all of this as a private citizen for a neutral nation. He has to convince the British that, yeah, it's all right to bring food in to these starving citizens. The British are saying, including Winston Churchill, what? No, that's Germany's problem. The rules of war, and I love Amy mentioning rules of war. We don't think of rules of war as exist anymore. In 1914, there were such things. There were the Geneva Conventions. That wasn't just Hogan's Heroes. And the conventions were neutral citizens are not combatants. You don't set fire to their villages. You don't take you don't take action against non-combatants. The Britons are saying, all right, that means if they're behind German lines, Germany has to feed them. Well, Germany has trouble enough feeding its army. It's not going to feed independent citizens. And the publicity, the PR stuff, the propaganda, if you will, we're not showing, we're showing this poor blind mother trying to take care of her daughter. God, how hard would your heart have to be not to reach into your pocket and give this poor person a nickel? Have you done your bit for Belgium? And here's a rank of Belgian orphans saying, more, please, more. And Hoover is in London and traveling back and forth between Brussels, between Rotterdam, between Paris, London, Berlin, organizing this food relief. I love this shot here. All the cooks are men, all the servers, women. This is a Belgian food warehouse showing the tens of thousands of tons of flour delivered. At its peak, the CRB was moving 120,000 tons of food a month across the Atlantic, just to give you some sense of the scale. The Belgians are delighted because this is their great hope. They're going to survive this war because of the CRB. And they send notes of thanks and photos of thanks, and you'll see there's the American flag in this little orphanage here. It's hard to see, but that's the American flag, that's the Belgian flag. Flour sacks decorated and sent as notes of gratitude back for Hoover. Hoover wasn't a sentimental guy. He traveled the world. We don't have much to document his early life as a mining engineer in Australia. We have 400 of these flour sacks in our museum. That's the only thing we have really from World War I that's not that's not paper-based or document. This actually had a lot of meaning for Hoover. I looked hard for an Iowa one. I failed to find one. Iowa did do their bit for the CRB. Hoover was a mining engineer and a numbers guy. So at the end of the war, when he started tallying up, he actually tallied state by state and sometimes town by town contributions made to the CRB. Iowa, there was actually a relief for Belgium commission started before the CRB. It was created by the governor in the middle of 1914, October. And over the next 3.5 years, it donated $125,000 to the CRB. And Hoover accounted for this because he understood doing this work, millions of dollars, literally almost $1 billion passed through the CRB coffers. And he said, look, people are going to look at us and say they grafted on this money. We must be totally open and above board. We must account to this down to the last nickel. His metaphor was we must have glass pockets and pure hearts. And when he accounted for it in Iowa, the one I remember was Grinnell College students and citizens gave $85.06 to the CRB. 6 cents. That's, and there was the Burlington Tin Cup, the school kids in Burlington, Iowa. They had a little tin cup fundraising drive, $15.75, which again I think is a pretty precise measure. Oh, Christ on a crutch. Oh, there we go. You've never heard that? Stick with me. I'll take you places in the English language can only be remotely assessed. All right. America stays out of the war until April 1917, for all the reasons that Amy laid out. But Hoover and Wilson and the people in Wilson's cabinet see that America is edging closer to war beginning in January 1917, and they're thinking, all right, all this stuff that we've negotiated for the CRB, predicated on this guy being a private citizen from a neutral nation, that's going to go into a cocked hat. What are we going to do if that comes to play? Wilson has seen the good that Hoover can do, and he says, if war comes, I want Hoover on my side, managing food on our side of the water, because I understand that he's a genius at this, and we all know that food is a weapon in this war. Food will win the war. As much as bullets, as much as battleships, food is a weapon. So this is Hoover and his family. Those are his boys. There's his wife. There's his 2 boys. He meets with Wilson in January. While Hoover's on this side of the water asking to raise money for the CRB, Wilson says, I've got a plan for you, but it has to wait until we're in the war. Hoover is intrigued, but he's also got to wrap up business with the CRB. He goes back, travels back to Europe in March 1917, March 13th, gets on okay, let's set the context. Unrestricted submarine warfare begins really in earnest in February 1917. German ships are taking down tons and tons of shipping. We're taking down 20 or 30 ships a week, including 5 to 7 American ships. Okay, if you have a vessel and it's in an American port and the Germans are taking them down, you think twice before sending a multi-million-dollar ship across the Atlantic through U-boat infested waters. So when Hoover wanted to get back to Europe, the only ship he could get was an old Spanish freighter, the Antonio Lopez. And he gets on this ship, he boards it in Brooklyn. It's sailing for Cadiz, so it's basically going to miss the most contentious waters in the North Atlantic. His wife packs him a lunch, basically, says, look, I know you're going to a food-starved place. Here's some butter, here's some meat, here's some fresh vegetables. Hoover comes onto the ship with this stuff and looks for the steward to have it put into cold storage. The steward looked at him blankly. 1, the steward only spoke Spanish. 2, cold storage? This is a 40-year-old freighter. We don't have no stinking cold storage. And Hoover realized after he boarded the ship, oh, all of their meat is on 4 hooves and in the front of the boat, bawing and bleeding on. He writes in his memoirs a wonderful description, of the sounds. I described them as a bovine orchestra protesting the rough passage. The smells. He said, I'll never, as long as I live, forget the smell of that ship. And also, he discovered that it wasn't just 4 hooved animals on board. It had a full contingent of rats and roaches that got into his food, and he never really got to eat the food. Sidebar. Meets with Wilson. He comes back stateside in May, meets with Wilson in May 1917. Wilson says, I want you to be in charge of food conservation and distribution in the United States, work with the Secretary of Agriculture. Hoover says, man, that's divided responsibility means nobody's accountable. I can't take the job on those terms. Hoover says, I'll take this job, but I have to be basically the food czar. I have to be absolutely in charge. People report to me. I'm willing to have the Secretary of Agriculture report to me. I'll work with him, but the only person I want to report to is Wilson. And Wilson's saying, man, it took me a week to get a declaration of war through the Senate. I'm really this is going to take some time. And Wilson spends a lot of political capital over the next 3 months getting the U.S. Food Administration set up so that Hoover would take it on. August 10th, it's Hoover's birthday, another inside Hoover joke, is named the Food Czar, and he's going to spend the next 15 months organizing and consolidating food conservation, distribution in America, because he understands if we can get food to Europe, it's going to have a bigger impact on the war than troops, because what was the American Army's size in like 1917? I'm looking at Jack. It was tiny, right? Like 140,000? 140,000. I mocked the Belgian army at the outset. The Belgians had a bigger army than America in 1914. Not in 1917, the Belgian army was crushed, but in 1914, they had a bigger army than America. Belgium, point to it on a map. Understands, food will win the war. So he organizes this voluntary effort, state by state, county by county, spends a lot of time mobilizing women. Why women? Because women controlled food in the American household. He understood that if he had the women on his side, he was going to get a lot farther along. So he promoted, in freedom's name, use corn, oats, potato, barley, rye, eat fish, egg, game, beans. What's being taken out of your menu here? Sugar, meat, and wheat. Wheatless Wednesdays. Ring a bell for anybody? Meatless Mondays. Okay, these were things that Hoover's PR department and Hoover's Food Administration championed. They show up in the fall of 1917, 21 meals a week if you're having 3 squares a day. By the beginning of 1918, 14 of those meals had strictures on them in Hoover's dietary recommendation. By the middle of 1918, 19 of those meals. So, pretty far-reaching. Food fight! You are... Sorry, you guys are too young. Okay, food fight on many fronts. Production, distribution, conservation. How does Hoover win these people over? He works with the big granaries. He works with the big distribution folks like Pillsbury, and works hard to have them improve their shipping and harvesting. Meatless Mondays. Here we have the Wednesday, all meals wheatless, 1 meal meatless. Gets the merchants to pledge. He gets homes to pledge to save the wheat, save the meat, save the oil, save the sugar. And does this all by tapping into a newly emerging, sorry, I'm going to skip by that, posters, propaganda. This is a poster that would have been in a store, Eat All the Food on Your Plate, the Clean Plate Club. Anybody have a Clean Plate Club mother besides me? You know, eat all the food on your plate? Only the old folks, I guess. I don't know. This is one of my favorite artifacts from our museum here. It is a Valentine. I can Hoover Eyes on dinners and on lights and fuel too, but I'll never learn to Hoover Eyes when it comes to loving you. Sweet. Food does win the war. Ultimately, America doubled its food export to Europe between 1917 and 1918. And this effort, as Amy quickly alluded to, was pivotal in breaking the stalemate and leading to negotiated settlement in November 11th, 1918. Germany sues for peace. Unfortunately, peace does not bring the end to hunger in Europe. There's still chaotic situations in Eastern Europe, and Hoover has to take the mechanisms that he set up with the CRB and the U.S. Food Administration and morph it into the American Relief Administration, which is going to once again take food from across the Atlantic, and this time rather than taking it into Belgium and Rotterdam, taking it in far deeper into Eastern Europe, deep into the Mediterranean, and into the Middle East and North Asia. This is a much greater logistical challenge on 2 fronts. 1, it's a longer supply line. 2, the war had left most rail lines and a lot of the ports in that part of the world devastated. And 3, there's this thing called the Russian Revolution, which has I love that the map here shows that in red, because the Red Army is moving to exert influence into Eastern Europe at this time. There are lots, it's a chaotic situation. Oh, and did I mention, whereas Belgium fed 6 to 8 million people over the course of World War I, 80 million people need food at this juncture. But Hoover's the guy. I'm going to skip through all that. He has now, at this point, had 7 years' experience raising money for food relief. He's got it down to a science. His genius part here is this food package where you can give $10 here, anywhere, to the ARA. And the ARA was kind of a global, it was a macro organization that organized the American Red Cross Relief, the Jewish Joint Distribution, what was left of the CRB. And you put your $10 on the table here, and they will send, I don't know if you can read this here, basically 120 pounds of flour, rice, beans, condensed milk, lard. That's good eating. To a specific location or family in Europe. Okay, we'll go back to what Amy said. 20 million Americans have a generation back been Europeans. You can send it to your grandmother in Lodz or Warsaw. And this is another Hoover innovation. In late 1920, and Hoover is still now, he's still in Europe. He's been in Europe for, well, he missed most of his kids' teen years. I've often wrestled with, was that a strategy? 3.5 million people, kids primarily, are facing starvation in Eastern Europe. And he says, here's my plan. We will have these fundraising dinners in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New Haven. And for the price of admission, I will feed you a 963-calorie meal for your $100 a plate dinner. And I will take the money and we will give it to our invisible guest. That empty plate, that empty chair at the table representing one of those millions of European families in desperate need of food. The invisible guest movement between December 1920 and February 1921 raised $30 million of private money. Hoover's goal was $33 million. He called off the fundraising when he realized, oh, commodity prices are going down. We only need $29.7 million. Stop asking for money. Because people are getting tired. I mean, we're talking about that America had been giving money to feed Europe at this point for 7 years. Wrapping up Hoover, between 1914 and 1922, headed 2 of the largest food relief efforts in history, nominated for the Nobel Prize. Didn't win it. It was easier to get nominated back in those days. You just had to have some academic somewhere say, you know who'd be a good Nobel Prize winner? Stalin got nominated. Hitler got nominated. Hoover got nominated. Goes on, his public service, the slippery slope that he stepped on in August 1914 continued. He serves as Commerce Secretary from 1921 to 28, President from 1929 to 33, leads the largest food relief effort in history after World War II, feeding, organizing UNICEF and helping to feed over 200 million people. Thank you. I'll take questions at the end. Jack, I left you more time.